back to Crime on the Clarkfork, the true crime podcast where I tell you about big crimes that happen in small places, with each case having occurred in areas with populations of 15,000 or less. My name is Mackenzie Spence, and I am your host. As always, if you listen on Spotify, if you turn on those automatic downloads, that would be a huge favor for me, and it will help the algorithm recommend this show to other people. And you'd also be notified every time an episode goes live if you click on the little bell button on the show's page, and then you'll just get a notification every time I post an episode. I sincerely apologize for not having a September episode. Life got insane, and the case that I am doing today, I have been writing for a while. Every time I think I am done, more things about this case come up that I'm able to find. So I finally just had to say, I think this is all that we're going to be able to get into this episode and just accept that. But just know that there's a lot more about this case out there than what I will be able to cover in today's episode. With that being said, I'm just going to jump right into it for all of you. So, the sources for this episode are census.gov, Wikipedia, KOTA Territory, CBC, CBS, Lakota Times, NBC, Native Sun News, Uncovered.com, History News Network, Indigenous Action Media, Indian Country News, Wayback Machine, Facebook, Indigenous Women for Justice, and Powwow Nation Live. Wanblee, South Dakota, 1975, population 314. On February 24th, 1976, a rancher named Roger Amiote found the body of a woman on the side of State Road 73, 10 miles from Wanblee, South Dakota. The farmer was out mending fences, and the snow in that area had been slowly melting, which left the body of the woman exposed after being hidden under the snow for some time. When authorities arrived at the scene, they took the dead woman to a medical practitioner, W.O. Brown, who conducted an autopsy. Through the autopsy, Brown determined that the woman had been dead for approximately 10 days and that she had died from exposure to the cold. At some point in this, the FBI began to become involved in the case, and because the woman was not identified by the autopsy or through any of those means, the FBI ordered that the woman's hands be cut off and sent to the FBI headquarters so fingerprints of the woman could be run to attempt an identification. On March 8th, just a couple weeks after the woman's body was found, there was still no official identification of the woman. Because of this, she was buried as Jane Doe in South Dakota in an unmarked grave. Tests eventually came back with a positive identification. Jane Doe was identified as an American Indian movement activist, Annie Aquash. Annie was a missing person who was last seen on December 11th, 1975, in Rapid City, South Dakota, which was actually odd because she was supposed to be in Denver, Colorado, staying at a friend's house while she was out on bail for a crime that she had committed. Annie's family began to fear that something was wrong when she didn't make her annual Christmas phone call to her friends, family, and 2 daughters, which was something that they had said had never happened before. Just 8 days after being buried as Jane Doe, the American Indian movement had her body exhumed so she could be buried at Naglagla Cemetery. The American Indian movement told Annie's daughters that she was prepared for the other side and that they had given her all the things that she would need in the afterlife. From now on in this episode, I am going to be shortening American Indian movement to AIM just for time purposes. So if I say AIM, I mean the American Indian movement. Annie Mae Aquash was born on March 27th, 1945, on the Indian Brook Reserve in Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia, to her mother, Mary Ellen Pictou, and her father, Francis Thomas Levi, and she was a member of the Mi'kmaq First Nation. She had two older sisters, Becky and Mary, and one younger brother, Francis. During her early childhood, her family lived in the Canadian wilderness in a wigwam, and eventually the children were abandoned at their wigwam. But luckily, rescuers found the children and brought them to the Indian Brook Reserve, where they then received their early education. When Annie turned 17 years old in 1962, she moved to Boston with a man named James Maloney. 2 years later, she and James had their first daughter together, Denise. And then 15 months later, they welcomed their second daughter, Debbie, into the world. The two got married in 1963, which was the year that their second daughter was born. While in Boston, Annie was able to meet American Indians as well as other First Nations individuals from Canada. In 1968 or 1969, Annie met people who were members of the American Indian movement, again, which is also known as AIM. AIM was founded in 1968 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and had the original goal of combating police brutality and discrimination against Native people. Also, around this time, Annie was involved in a program called the Teaching and Research in Bicultural Education Schools Projects, also known as TRIBES, which was a program that taught young Native Americans about the history of their people. She was also involved in the creation of the Boston Indian Council, which is now called the North American Center of Boston. And this center works to improve conditions for Indians that live in the city of Boston. It was in the middle of the year in 1970 when Annie found that her husband, James, was having an affair. Because of this, Annie filed divorce proceedings. In 1972, Annie participated in the march known as the Trail of Broken Treaties. This march started on the west coast of the United States and ended in Washington, D.C. at the United States Capitol building. They then began to occupy the national headquarters of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they presented a list of 20 demands to the U.S. government, 12 of which were regarding treaty issues. Because of her activism and involvement with AIM, Annie eventually met a man named Nogishik Aquash, who was from Walpole Island, Canada, and in 1972, they began to date. The following year, In February 1973, the couple went to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota to join fellow AIM members and members of the Oglala Lakota tribe in response to internal issues that were occurring. This led to the occupation of Wounded Knee, which was a 71-day occupation, and federal law enforcement was involved. On Annie's first night in South Dakota, a fellow activist told her that the newcomers were needed to do kitchen duty, to which Annie replied, and I quote, "Mr. Banks, I didn't come here to wash dishes. I came here to fight." End quote. During this occupation, Nagishik and Annie were married by a Lakota elder, Wallace Black Elk, in a native ceremony on April 12, 1973, which was just under a month before the occupation ended. Now, the couple did not stay married long, but Annie kept Nagishik's last name after they split. Over the next few years, Annie continued to be involved in activism with AIM, as well as other programs intended for Native people, including the Red Schoolhouse Project in Minneapolis, and she was often seen at these different projects and programs with her 2 children by her side. Some of the activism that she was involved in included the 1974 armed occupation in Kenora, Ontario, at Anishinaabe Park, and the 1975 armed occupation of the Alexian Brothers' novitiate in Gresham, Wisconsin, and that one lasted a month. Her daughters recall spending much of their childhood traveling around the United States, participating in AIM events, but they also remember that Annie made sure to prioritize their safety. So, if she knew something was going to be dangerous, she would not take them with her. In 1975, Annie was arrested twice for federal weapons-related charges, but both times she was released rather quickly. Unfortunately for Annie, her quick releases from jail created suspicion from fellow AIM members that she may have been an informant for the U.S. government. This is because, on March 12, 1975, a prominent member of AIM was discovered to be an informant for the FBI. The man's name was Douglas Durham, and he was actually the head secretary for the organization and had been moving up the ranks of AIM for over 2 years. This man had gone as far as dyeing his hair black and adopting the clothing style of fellow AIM members, which included beadwork, ribbon shirts, and traditionally native jewelry. He was publicly denounced by Annie and AIM officials, and he was removed from AIM at a public press conference in March 1975. Now, again, since Annie was released rather quickly after being arrested for weapons charges, there began to be suspicion that she was also an informant, similar to Durham. It also didn't help that Annie had been moving up in the organization and had also begun to take on more decision-making roles within AIM. She was also rather close with leaders within the organization, including Leonard Peltier and Dennis Banks. She and Banks had even developed an intimate relationship that began in the summer of 1974, even though Banks was married to another woman through common law. At some point during this time, Banks had gone into hiding, and Annie had joined him multiple times throughout 1975, moving through the western U.S. in an RV with other AIM members, which included Leonard Peltier, Kenny Loudhawk, Russ Redner, and Darlene Nichols, to name a few. It's also believed that Annie was traveling around the U.S. with these other AIM members so that she would be able to be watched, especially because some of the AIM leadership didn't fully trust her and, again, believed that she was an informant in one way or another. Around this time, 2 FBI agents were involved in a shootout with AIM and were ultimately killed. And the FBI believed that the person who pulled the trigger was Leonard. This further caused the FBI to have its eyes on AIM and those that are involved in the organization. In late October of 1975, Annie had spoken to some of her friends about how she had wanted to leave and wanted to go back to Canada, but that she was not allowed to do so. In November of 1975, the RV and the group of 8 members was in Oregon. The RV was pulled over by a state trooper, and unfortunately for everyone in the RV at the time, the officer ordered everyone to get out of the vehicle, which was full of explosives and guns. Banks and Peltier were able to escape, but Annie, Loudhawk, Redner, along with others, were all taken to jail. While Annie was in jail at this time, she sent 2 letters. One to a man named John Treadell and her AIM family, and another to her family back in Canada. In the letter to John, she included a ring, and previous to this, Annie and John had agreed that if she were to ever send him this ring, it would mean that she was in trouble. The letter itself stated that there were 2 informants that had penetrated the group, and they were the ones that had informed law enforcement to where they could find Peltier and Banks, leading to their arrest. Annie was in jail for a total of 10 days before she was released on bail in Pierre, South Dakota. Not long after she was released, she traveled down to Denver, Colorado to stay with a man named Troy Lynn Yellowwood Williams. While in Denver, Annie sent the ring indicating that she was in trouble to a woman in California named Mathaleen Whitebear. And not long after this, Annie was seen for the last time in Rapid City, South Dakota. When Annie's body was exhumed on March 10th, 1976, so she could be buried as someone other than Jane Doe, AIM had requested a second autopsy be completed. Her friends and family did not believe that Annie would have wandered into the South Dakota winter underdressed. It just did not make sense. A pathologist named Dr. Gary Peterson completed the second autopsy and found that Annie had been shot by a .32 caliber on the left side of the back of her head, as if she was executed. The shot itself entered just under her hairline, traveled upwards, and lodged itself into her left eye socket. Now the question arises, how did the person who completed the first autopsy, miss such an obvious cause of death? AIM immediately blamed the FBI for her murder, and at first, the Bureau of Indian Affairs were in charge of Annie's case because they had jurisdiction over crimes that occurred on the reservation. And even though her body was not found on the reservation, it was thought that her murder had, because she had been seen on the Pine Ridge Reservation prior to her disappearance. On March 12th, 1976, Annie was buried again by members of AIM. According to Sioux elders, when the body of a murder victim is moved, the wind howls. The weekend that Annie was buried was met with 30-mile-per-hour winds, which shook Jumping Bull Hall, where the wake was held. At the wake, the AIM flag was hung up, as well as a copy of a picture of Annie from one of her arrests in Oregon. In the photo, Annie was chained waist to waist in protest. Other flags were hung in the hall in colors of yellow, black, white, and red, which represented the four winds. Finally, there were presents for Annie on top of the coffin for her to take into the next life: cigarettes, tobacco, moccasins, and beaded clothing. Over time, it has been speculated that the FBI lied about whether the police or other FBI agents had noticed the bullet wound to the back of Annie's head in the initial investigation, which also makes some wonder what else they may have lied about during this time. For many, they wondered if the FBI lied to protect someone else that was serving as an informant at the time. During the years around Annie's death, the FBI had sent a number of people to act as spies or provocateurs into activist groups across the United States. The job of the planted people was to spread rumors that others in the activist groups were FBI informants, which often led to those within the movement to begin to point fingers. This caused some movements at the time to implode, and in some cases, it caused people to be killed. And again, as it was stated earlier, Annie was often fighting rumors that she was an FBI informant. Just days after Annie was murdered, that December, the FBI received a tip from an informant that a Native woman had been killed by AIM, and even named the 3 people who were involved. The FBI did nothing with this tip, and even after Annie's body was found, they still did nothing. The following years and decades, Annie's case sat cold because the public was led to believe that there were no good leads to follow. It wasn't until 2003 that traction began again on the case. And this only happened because, in 1999, true crime enthusiasts and investigators publicly named who they believed to be the person who pulled the trigger on Annie. In 2003, 2 men named John Graham and Arlo Looking Cloud were charged with the murder of Annie. Looking Cloud was arrested in Denver, where he was living on the streets as an alcoholic. When he was brought into the station, He told the officers that he was still under the influence of alcohol, but this did not stop them from questioning him about Annie's murder or having him sign his statements. Because of this recorded questioning, which also led to a confession from Looking Cloud, he was put on trial for the murder of Annie in 2004. There was no physical evidence that tied Looking Cloud to Annie's murder, but the recorded confession authorities obtained during his questioning, where he admitted to being at the scene of the crime, was admitted to evidence. Looking Cloud attempted to get around this confession, stating that he was high and drunk at the time of the interview, but this didn't really work because he had actually spoken to multiple other people during various times about his involvement and presence at the murder prior to his arrest or indictment. Some of the people that he had spoken about this with included his adopted brother, Richard Tuelk, a former AIM chairman, John Trudell, and Annie's two daughters, Denise and Debbie, who all testified against him at trial. Not to mention that during his trial, he claimed that while he was involved in the murder, he was not the one that pulled the trigger. That was John Graham. After just 5 days, Looking Cloud was convicted for the murder of Annie Aquash. This conviction left him with a life sentence to be served in Florence, Colorado, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Also during Looking Cloud's trial, a man named Bruce Ellison invoked his Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. Now, the kicker for this is that Ellison had been Leonard Peltier's lawyer since the 1970s. Due to this, and him evoking his Fifth Amendment rights at the trial for Looking Cloud, the prosecutor in that case actually ended up calling him a co-conspirator, but he was never charged with anything. Between Annie's murder in 1975 and John Graham being charged with the murder, Graham had moved to Vancouver, Canada, which is where he was ultimately arrested. Because of this, he had to be extradited back to the United States so he could be tried in court back in South Dakota. The extradition of Graham back to the U.S. to face his crime took over 4 full years because he fought that extradition as hard as he could. In 2006, the Prime Minister of Justice in Canada ordered John to be extradited to the U.S. to face the charges put against him, but Graham appealed the order, so he was put under house arrest with conditions. Finally, in July of 2007, the courts denied his appeal and the extradition order was upheld, which Graham appealed once again, but his second appeal was also denied and he was extradited in December of 2007 back to South Dakota. In 2008, another man named Richard Marshall was indicted for aiding and abetting the first-degree murder of Annie. He went to trial in 2010, but was found not guilty by the jury after they deliberated for less than 2 hours. During this trial, Looking Cloud had testified that the gun that was used to kill Annie was provided by Marshall, but Marshall's attorney was able to convince the jury that Looking Cloud's testimony was not credible due to his history of drug and alcohol abuse, as well as his history of lying to authorities in the past. John Graham finally went to trial in 2010 in Pennington County, South Dakota, where he was finally convicted of the murder of Annie Aquash. For Graham's trial, Looking Cloud was offered a reduced sentence if he agreed to provide testimony against Graham in court, which he agreed to do. Due to this, instead of serving that life sentence, Looking Cloud's sentence was reduced to 20 years, and he was released from prison in 2020. Graham challenged his conviction, which eventually caused the case to be sent to the South Dakota Supreme Court, but the court upheld the original guilty verdict and solidified his sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, which he is serving today in a South Dakota prison. Now, what actually happened to Annie? While Annie was out on bail in 1975, the rumors of her being an informant for the government did not cease. It's also believed that Annie had been told by Leonard, the man who the FBI believed killed those 2 FBI agents in the shootout prior to Annie's disappearance, that he did indeed shoot those 2 agents on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Because she was thought to be an informant and Leonard had confessed to her, she was kidnapped by 3 individuals who were all AIM members: John Graham, Arlo Looking Cloud, and John Graham's aunt, Theda Clark, on December 10th, 1975. The 3 individuals took Annie from Denver to Rapid City, South Dakota, which is the last place that she was seen alive. Annie was held in an apartment in Rapid City that was owned by a woman named Thelma Rios, which is not to be confused with Theda Clark. On December 11th, 1975, Annie was taken to Bruce Ellison's office, who was the AIM attorney, and she was also brought to the office of the Wounded Knee Legal Defense Committee in Rapid City. During her time in these 2 offices, she was questioned by various members of AIM. There have been a few AIM members that have admitted to the media that they were involved in the questioning on December 11th, but that the goal was just to scare her a bit, not to harm her. Later that day, after the hours of questioning, Annie was taken from that second office and brought back to Thelma's home, where she was being held in the basement. Not too long after arriving at the residence, she was moved once again to another home owned by Thelma, where she was then raped by John Graham and other AIM members before being forced to cut all of the tags off of her clothing. That night, Thelma's mother had actually seen Annie being held in that second home, but she did nothing to help her. Late that night, between 10 p.m. and midnight, Graham, Looking Cloud, and Clark tied Annie up and put her in the trunk of Clark's vehicle. They drove to Richard Marshall's house in Allen, South Dakota. And again, Marshall was a member of AIM and was in a leadership position within the organization. He's also the one who was charged with aiding and abetting, but was ultimately not convicted. According to Marshall's wife, Cleo Gates, the 3 other AIM members, Looking Cloud, Graham, and Clark, had stopped by her and Marshall's house the night that Annie was murdered. Gates testified that Annie had been with her in the kitchen while her husband and the 3 others went into a back bedroom of the house. Gates gave Annie a donut and a coffee, as well as a change of clothes. It's believed that Annie's wallet was taken from her during this time. During the meeting in the back bedroom of the house, Graham, Marshall, Clark, and Looking Cloud discussed a note that simply said, and I quote, "Dick, take care of this baggage," end quote. Marshall gave Graham a gun and ammunition before they all left with Annie in the early hours of December 12th, 1975. They then drove out to the Badlands near Wanblee, which is where Graham shot Annie in the back of the head, execution style, while she begged for her life and prayed for her daughters. She was executed on the edge of a cliff, and when the shot did not cause her to fall over the edge, she was pushed and fell. She was not killed instantly, but she eventually curled into a ball before passing away. On May 11th, 1976, Annie's sisters back in Canada received Annie's wallet in the mail from an attorney named Ken Tilson, who was representing AIM members in the murder of a man named Martin Montello. Tilson did not turn over the wallet to authorities, which some argue should have left him with a charge for evidence tampering. And because of this, the authorities were unable to examine the wallet for trace evidence or to see what the content of the wallet was. Tilson has claimed that he has no recollection of having the wallet or sending it to Annie's sisters, and blames that on a stroke that he had that has left the years of 1975 and 1976 blank in his memory. Authorities believe that Annie was murdered because the leaders within AIM thought that she was an informant for the government, and AIM claimed that they had nothing to do with her death. Both prosecutors, as well as government witnesses, claimed that Annie was not an informant. Clark was never charged with involvement in Annie's murder because by the time the charges were announced, she was in a nursing home suffering from Alzheimer's. Thelma Rios, the woman whose apartment Annie was held at prior to her murder, was charged for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of Annie. But she managed to avoid a trial because she was in bad health and agreed to a plea deal. In court, Thelma admitted that she, and I quote, relayed a message from AIM leadership to other AIM members to bring Annie from Denver to Rapid City in December 1975 because they thought she was a government informant. End quote. She also told the court that she had overheard two people, who were never named, ordering Annie to be brought to Rapid City from Denver, which then led to a discussion between the two about offing her. The plea deal required her to acknowledge her involvement in the events that led to Annie's death and had her agree to the charges of being an accessory to Annie's kidnapping, which held a 5-year sentence. But again, her poor health at the time of the plea agreement caused her sentence to be suspended. She died of lung cancer in February of 2011. Now, what I have spoken about so far is what the official record states what happened to Annie. With that being said, there are other theories that have come up around what may have happened to her. The first is that the FBI had something to do with Annie's death. It's claimed that Annie told someone that an FBI agent named David Price had threatened that if she didn't become an FBI informant on Leonard Peltier, that she would die within a year. The FBI being behind Annie's death is what AIM had pointed to from the moment her body was identified. This is also a theory because the original person who did the autopsy did not notice the bullet wound. They were hired by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a government agency. The second theory is the one that we have been talking about, that Annie was killed by AIM. There have been witnesses that have stated that after Annie was under the suspicion of being an FBI informant, Leonard had interrogated her with a gun held to her head. Leonard and David Hall had also made Annie participate in making bombs for AIM that would then be planted at power plants on the Pine Ridge Reservation. They ensured that Annie was involved in this, so her fingerprints would be on them. When AIM believed that they had informants in their group, they would regularly take one of two routes. The first is that they would call them out in public, and the second, and what we are seeing here, is that they would make them be involved in illegal activities. This way, if they were working for the government, it would mean that the government was then being involved in illegal activity, which could then lead to dismissal of charges against members of AIM. On top of the fact that Annie was being required to make bombs for AIM at this time, Looking Cloud and Graham were rather young, and they would have taken part in Annie's death, which makes many believe that they were instructed to kill her by upper-level leadership within the organization, especially because Annie was prominent in the organization herself. Annie's daughter, Denise, remembers the last time she saw her mom. Annie had gotten on her knees in front of Denise and her sister and told Denise to look after Debbie and that she needed her to be the older sibling. She also told the girls to never lie, but to always speak the truth. Denise believes that her mom knew that she was in trouble and that was going to be the last time she was going to see her girls. Today, Denise serves as the executive director for the Indigenous Women for Justice group, which she founded. She and Debbie both believe that their mother was ordered to be killed by those in leadership positions within AIM. In an interview in 2004, Denise said that she believes it was AIM that murdered her mother and that she believes that her mom knew too much. She stated, and I quote, "She knew what was happening in California. She knew where the money was coming from to pay for the guns. She knew the plans. But more than any of that, she knew about the killings of the 2 FBI agents." End quote. In 2004, Annie's body was exhumed one last time so she could be laid to rest in her home country of Canada at the Indian Brook Reserve in Nova Scotia. When her body was exhumed, her daughters assumed that she was properly prepared for burial due to stories that they had heard from AIM members growing up. But when they were sent her exhumed body, they received her naked and wrapped in a plastic morgue sheet, which was far from how they were told and believed that she was buried back in 1976. The day before her final wake, on June 17th, 2004, John Graham and his attorneys filed for an injunction to stop Annie from being buried. They requested that a third autopsy be completed. Many, including Annie's family, were shocked at the injunction, as John and his attorneys had 7 full weeks to request this autopsy from the time that Annie was exhumed and delivered to her family in Canada. Not only this, but the fact that John and his attorneys chose the day before her final burial, when tribal elders, family members, and friends had arrived or were nearly there, was just another way to deny Annie dignity at her final burial. Finally, on June 21st, 3 days after the initial burial and funeral day, Annie was able to be officially put to rest. On the Indian Brook Reserve, the community gathered around Annie's family for her return home, and they planned events such as a powwow and concert in conjunction with her funeral, which was held on National Aboriginal Day, which is a Canadian holiday that's purpose is to celebrate Canada's native population's heritage and cultures. Now I want to leave you with a quote from Annie that I believe shows how strong she truly was and how much she cared about what she believed in. And I quote, "These white people think this country belongs to them. They don't realize that they are only in charge right now because there's more of them than there are of us. The whole country changed with only a handful of raggedy-ass pilgrims that came over here in the 1500s. And it can take a handful of raggedy-ass Indians to do the same, and I intend to be one of those raggedy-ass Indians." End quote. And that is the end of this case. Again, I apologize for not having a September episode. This case was so big and there were so many different moving parts that I really could only scratch the surface of what Annie truly deserves and her story to be told. So, as always, please give me 5 stars on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and a review on Apple Podcasts if you have time. I'm always looking for cases to cover, so if you have a case suggestion, please visit the link in the show's Instagram page at Crime on the Clarkfork. I also post pictures from the cases that I cover on this podcast over on that Instagram page. So go give that a quick follow and let me know what your thoughts are on this case in the comments. Do you think Annie was killed by those that are behind bars for her murder? Or do you think it was an FBI cover-up? I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will catch you next time with more big crime in small places.